Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a manuscript editor, a writing coach, copy editor, a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and a novelist. And you're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with Lorrie Fields. Lorrie is a memoirist and historian. She's written a very powerful memoir about her about being widowed twice, not just once. I mean, it's hard enough to even imagine being widowed once. But Lorrie, welcome to One to One, and been looking forward to this for a long time.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
You're welcome. So let's get right to it. I want to bring the cover in. I'm going to get rid of that blah blah there. Twice widowed, and obviously you're very young. So
Oh,
that's
thank you.
and you were first widowed when you'd only been married a couple of years. Am
Yeah,
I
I was
right?
in my early 20s, and then the second time in my 50s, in my later 50s. Yeah.
So I, I I I'm always reluctant to ask personal in-depth questions, although I'm a very curious person. And so I want to give you an out. If I'm getting too personal, you don't have to answer, but at the same time, you've been very vulnerable in this
Yes.
book. So first talk about, let me ask it this way. How old were you when you got married?
Well, my first husband and I,
First one.
we were high school sweethearts, and so we went off to college together. So we got married right after high school and went off to college together. He'd already been in college. He played baseball for University of Arizona. And so he'd been there a year. And then as soon as I graduated, we got married and went off to college together. So
And so my question is, what kind of expectations did you have about life going into marriage? And how did you respond to this curveball that life threw at you?
well, it was quite shocking. I mean, no, I hadn't known anybody who had passed away in my family or my life at that point. So, you really don't expect to experience death. So it was, it was quite shocking. We had a whole future in front of us, and we weren't supposed to be able to have children. So we spent the first couple of years of our marriage trying to have children, and finally when we had our son, he was 3 months old, we were in this car accident, he passed away. So
Mm.
it was just, uh, I was numb, I was shocked, I was questioned everything that I had believed about life. And it your body and your mind treats loss like a threat, and it is a threat because all of a sudden everything's a danger, and so it was pretty difficult to get through. But I had to sort of put aside my own personal grief at the time because we had this 3-month-old son who had brain injuries from the car accident, and I was injured. And so my focus was really on his health and helping him to recover. And so, it kind of pushed my grief off for a time.
Well, and this was a car accident, and you were severely injured as well, right?
Yeah, I was. I broke my back and my pelvis, and of course that seemed really insignificant compared to my son's brain injury and my husband's death. So, I did have a nurse who lived with me. I was really, really, really blessed to have her for 2 years. She lived with me and she helped with the baby. Um, but we had to do neurological therapy with him, and so I was just super busy those first 2 years on recovering his life and mine. And then it was, and then I met my second husband a couple years after that in Hawaii. My family had moved to Hawaii when I was in college, so I thought that was quite unfair that they moved after I went off to college
Yeah.
to Hawaii. Yeah. So, but after a few years, my parents actually knew my husband Daryl, who you see on the screen there. He had gone to the church that they had attended, and so they sort of connived this meetup with me. And I was, I was so young, and I said, "Oh, I'm never getting married again." But that was silly to think that in my 20s. But I was serious. I just didn't imagine how that could happen. Anyway, long story short,
Why did you feel that way? Why so nihilistic about a
I
future?
don't I just felt like, well, how could I ever love somebody the same? And I made a vow, and it was hard to think about breaking that. And I hadn't really thought about myself or getting into another relationship, just because I was so preoccupied with my son's health and mind. So I hadn't really thought about my future that much, really, or falling in love again. Of course, he was so cute and so handsome, it was hard for me to not have noticed that.
Right. And so how long after your first husband's death did Daryl come along?
It was, let's see, it was like 2.5 years that I met him. And then we started dating, and
Okay, stop
yeah.
there. Did he have to persuade you, or was it, were you open, right from the beginning? How did that all
No, I
work?
wasn't. I wasn't so open, but it was this weird sort of just this bisociation going on in my head, because I was attracted to him, but in my mind, I felt like I was betraying my first husband. And I think part of that, John, was because I hadn't properly grieved my first husband yet. You
What do you
know,
mean? What do you mean properly
well,
grieved?
I I really didn't process his death. He wasn't really dead to me. And that really brings up this point about what happens, just the neurobiology of grief. Because even though you know that they died, there's this implicit memory that does not accept it, and you're constantly looking for them. And if you don't process that, and you don't take time to start a new life, and to create new memories, you're still stuck with looking for them. Your brain is constantly looking for them. So your brain has a real problem to solve with any loss. And so I was still in that place where my brain was not accepting that my first husband was gone. And so I felt like I was betraying him to be even thinking about having a romantic relationship with somebody else.
Now that's you. Now your first husband's
Yeah,
name
was
was, I'm sorry,
Jeff
Jeff. Right, that's
Wade.
right.
Yeah.
And the second husband looks a lot like the first husband.
Yeah, they
What's up?
do.
What's up with that?
I don't know. They're both really cute, aren't they?
Yeah, well, that's the second husband. So we
Yeah,
can go back and forth. Number
yeah.
one, number two, almost indistinguishable. So I don't know. Did that make it easier though that there was a similarity, or
Well,
were their
I didn't
personalities
I didn't
different?
I didn't see it that way at first. They both had blue eyes, and they both had long lashes, and so that was similar, but I didn't see them as looking alike until later on, when people say, "Oh, they look alike," and it's like, "Oh, yeah, I guess they sort of do." So, yeah, maybe
It's
I'm just
almost it's almost like you're the last one to figure out
yeah,
what's
I'm just
going on.
subconsciously attracted to that sort
Yeah.
of looking man, I suppose. Uh,
So, Daryl came along about 2.5 years later. And how long of a courtship was it?
Well, it wasn't long. We were dating like 3 months, and he knew he wanted to marry me, and I was like, no, I mean, you got to ask me again. But he knew he wanted to, but I knew I wasn't quite ready. And here's something that was really beautiful and very interesting about my second husband is he sort of took a step back when he realized that I still was processing things, because I was still, when we got married, I was still having nightmares about my first husband coming back to life and being angry at me, and just like going through. So internally, I was not processing this new life. I was like feeling guilty moving on in moving forward in my life. I don't
Right.
know if moving on is the right word. I don't know that you ever move on, but you move forward. And it
That's a
was
word. Moving forward is a word I prefer as opposed to moving
it's
on.
better, right?
Yeah,
Because
it is, because
moving
moving
on is like
on
it
is
doesn't matter.
you button it up and it's over and you just move on, move on.
Yeah, you
Moving
can't.
forward is you're moving with this part of you that has changed, this emotional scarring and all that. You're moving forward, but not on. That's just, it's maybe semantics.
You know about that too, because your novel that I read, Enemies Domestic, both your characters, your main characters in there, have experienced loss, and as I know you, this kind of emotionally biographical too, because you've experienced loss in your life. So
Right.
So you know full well that you don't really
I
move on.
Well, and you mentioned processing because my sister took her life in 1980, but I never really processed it. And so the very first novel, Fast Track, which I started writing maybe 15 years after she died, less 14 maybe, is me probably processing that death. And it wasn't until my son died in 2011 that I actually went through formal grief counseling. Did you ever do that, formal grief counseling?
I this the second time I did, because there were layers of losses in my life, not just my husband's death. You know, we worked together, and so there was a lot of career things that were upended, and there was just multiple layers of loss. My sister died like 5 months before my husband did, and then my dad died exactly 1 year after my husband did, and I had to take care of him, get him in a nursing home. So there was a lot going on. It's
Right.
like in both of these griefs with both husbands, there were things that prevented me from being able to process things, you know.
We've used the word processing a lot. Can you deconstruct that? What does that really mean?
Well, I think you have to give yourself some space for that. And by that, I don't, I sort of debunk the five stages theory, because I don't think that's actually helpful or realistic, even though you can learn something from the stages that people go through, but it was actually written for the dying, not for those of us left behind. And so you don't really go through it like you go through these steps and you check them off a list and you end up in never land. It's not like that, because grief has its own timeline, and you have to feel safe enough in order to grieve. And when there's a lot of things going on in your life, you're not going to be able to go there and process things. And then you get slapped upside the head with a memory or a smell or a picture or something every once in a while. But I didn't give myself the time to even go through pictures and sort through things slowly, because there was just so much going on.
Right.
And so processing means a lot of different things, and sometimes not processing things is processing it, because your brain can't handle it, right? So
Right.
so taking a walk, going, I was really blessed to be able to go on these trips. My friends took me to Europe, and I saw beautiful things and experienced nature and experienced myself alone in nature, and that was really, really helpful. And that was part of processing, you
Right.
know. So there's when I talk about processing, it's like just being kind to yourself, giving yourself space, and not putting yourself, because we can sort of think we're deviant if we don't get over something quick enough, and the world makes you feel that way.
Right.
You have
Let me
something
stop you
go.
just for a quick second. I interviewed Kubler-Ross briefly in 1978, and she made it clear that the stages of grief were not meant to be considered step by step. She said people go back and forth among all those stages.
I'm glad you
And
mentioned that, but other people haven't interpreted it that to be
oh,
that.
absolutely. She had
Yeah,
to keep fighting that all the way. And
she
I think it
did.
was it David Kessler that wrote two books with her. And after his son died of a drug overdose, he wrote the book, The Sixth Stage of Grief, Finding Meaning. Does that
Okay.
resonate? Does that resonate with you in terms of finding meaning as a way of, processing your grief?
Yeah, because you don't know that you can. And I've talked to so many widows and widowers who are just biding their time and feeling like, well, I'm just going to survive and not find joy. And what I've discovered in learning about myself again and rediscovering myself alone in the world, and really falling in love with my humanity all over again, is that not only can we find joy again, but we can thrive, and we can rediscover ourselves, and we can find an identity in who we are created to be as individuals. And it takes bravery to do that. It's easier to not do that. It's easier just to give into it and not try. But we have to put the effort into making those new memories to help our brain to be able to add
What is
in
it that
those memories.
what is it that's frightening about that?
Will be sometimes it makes people feel like, well, then what what was that about? Did my life really count? Did my marriage really count? Did all the dreams that we have, what were they worth? And so to walk away from that, or it feels like you're walking away from that to move on with your life, it makes you feel as if you're nullifying that. And
Right.
so I think that's a fear that people have.
Is
And
it is it is it a fear of what other people will think of you?
I think that is part of it. I mean, I think I had that. I had certain expectations because what happened with me is that because I had these layers of losses and I really tapped into a weakness that I had never felt before. And I think part of my identity was my strength. And I had really good friends saying, "Hey, what's wrong with you? We need you to snap out of it." And it was like, snap out of what? you know, but that was the expectation that people had. And I felt that pressure. And I felt that pressure because we had this nonprofit and I had, people tell me, well, it's been a year now. And since you haven't, because at the time, my husband and I were working on this historical TV series. And because I didn't get it sold that first year, it was like, well, they pulled all my funding. And it was like, wait, my dad
It's,
just died. My
it's
sister
another
died.
loss,
What?
another loss.
And it was like, so I felt that. And then I allowed myself to put that pressure on myself just to try to quickly snap out of it. But the beautiful thing about it is that I crashed and I
That's
had to
that's
know
beautiful.
it was the most beautiful thing for me because it helped me to be able to embrace my suffering in a way that helped me to transcend. And I think that's the beauty of suffering, is that it fast tracks us to be able to live beyond the mundane and to live beyond the fear of man and the fear of what people think, and to really tap into who we really are created to be. And that was the most spectacular, terrible thing that happened, because it was very difficult and very painful for me to tap into a weakness that I didn't know that I could experience. And I
I
didn't
mean,
know that I didn't know I could get depressed.
right, right.
I
I
had
mean,
never been depressed before.
you just used a phrase that I don't think I've ever heard before, and that's the beauty of suffering, which sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, doesn't it? But when we embrace the suffering and we learn to be able to transcend the everyday stuff, that's what suffering allows us to do. Um, you kind of tap into something that is beyond everyday worries.
Right.
And I'm not saying it's easy to do, but I'm saying it's a beautiful thing when it happens.
Okay, I have a few more questions. No surprise there. Um, Talk about, I mean, people, friends, when these kinds of things happen, they want to be supportive. And from the people I know who've gone through losses, people think they're being helpful, and they're really not.
Yeah, right.
Can you speak to that? What can people do to be supportive? What do people do and say that they think is supportive and really isn't?
Well, oh my gosh, we
This
need
could be a whole show. This could be
it could be, and it could be really funny or it could be really sad too. Um, I had, I mean, I had, when my first husband passed away, I had someone tell me, um, well, at least you didn't lose a parent because you can always get a new husband. It's like, oh yeah, sure, from a catalog or something.
yeah,
I'll just go order one, you know, and just all kinds of crazy things, and people have to somehow justify things in their mind about why someone died.
yeah.
And I had someone tell me that my first husband's theology was wrong, so God couldn't let him live.
Oh my God.
And then I had someone tell me that he was like Enoch, so God had to just take him. It was like, it was just these crazy ways that people justify, or people will say, God needed him, so they had to
That's
take him. I'm like, no, 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 God didn't need him. I needed him,
right.
right?
Right.
But I think people really do want to help, and so it's you can't get angry at people, but
Right.
it does set you back on your heels a little bit because you don't quite know how to respond to them. And I think, from our side, when we've experienced loss, we just, you can just say thank you. And there's times when people keep going, you go, that's not really helpful right now. And it's okay to say that to others.
That
But
that must have taken some guts to do that.
it does, because they're trying to be helpful, and I find myself then instructing them on how to help me.
Right.
Like, or like say, what, can we just take a walk, or, let's go to the beach or something. And, and sometimes or I would say to someone, sometimes it's helpful just to say nothing.
Well, and sometimes it might be helpful if somebody just says, what do you need? Do you need to be listened to? Do you need a hug? Do I just need to be here? What can I do to help?
But when you're in the midst of grief, sometimes that's even overwhelming for people. So what I say to someone is, if you want to help someone, bring them a meal, make them a cup of tea, weed their garden for them. Things that are so overwhelming, because life gets really complicated fast when your brain is your dendrites and your neurons actually do shrink and change, and so you can't process information as well. And so sometimes even people asking what do you need is almost an overwhelming question when you're in the middle of such grief.
Okay,
So
well, that's helpful to hear. I can
yeah.
remember when I'd been away from work for about several weeks after Stephen died, and I was on the metro going to work, and there was a woman I worked with who sat next to me. I didn't know her well, and she said, "Well, it's good to see that you've snapped out of it." And,
Yeah.
and as soon as she said that, there was this look of horror that came over her face, like, well, that wasn't the right thing to say. And I remember sending her an email when I got to the office saying, I appreciate, your concern, and
Yeah, right.
don't worry about it, because she was very apologetic. And
Yeah.
because I didn't snap out of it. I don't think I ever will.
No. But sometimes someone saying, well, let me know what I can do for you. Most grieving people are never going to tell you.
Right. And they maybe sometimes know that, so they know that they're saying the right thing, but they don't want to really get sucked into it.
Yeah. So I think just, being proactive and, just go weed somebody's garden, or take out the trash, or make them a cup of tea, or, if they have young children, offer to help with the kids or something like that, and things like that.
Does it help to have faith? Did that help you, or was that a hindrance in some ways?
Well, sometimes it was, because there's no que sera when you believe in God, like he doesn't exist, and so you do have to. The first time I didn't question my faith so much. The second time was a real challenge. So that was new and different. But I think it does in the end help, because in the end, my deeply personal faith helped me get through some of the worst times ever. And sometimes that was all that I had, because,
In what way? How did faith help?
well, I mean, my husband and I pastor a church, right? So we had faith. But we were also not pastoring at the time when he passed away, and we're outside of ministry. And we had spent a lot of time, working on this historical story, and not really feeling like we fit in to that world anymore as we had in the past. So I had this more organic approach to my faith at the time. And music has always been important to me. And so music really helped me. And music helps almost anybody going through a hard time, because it switches on a different part of your brain. And sometimes it would be, worship music, or sometimes it would be classical music, or sometimes it would be my CCR, or,
Well, that's
something like that. But music was really important to helping me. But the parts that got to the deepest in me was helping me to confess that God was faithful when it didn't feel like he was being faithful. And I think he was
that's hard
on
to
my naughty
do.
list for a while.
And that's hard to do if you're in some sort of faith community, because it's hard to admit, doubt or anger at God or anything like that, when, that is supposedly a weakness, and that I can remember, maybe you've read it, C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. You know,
Yes.
his
Yeah.
wife, he was a confirmed bachelor until he was surprised by Joy, and then she got cancer. And I think there's one phrase that I remember from the book, that he looked at God as a cosmic Scrooge.
Yeah. It is, and I think I had got on my naughty list. You probably read about that, you know. So I had him on my naughty list for a while and wasn't talking to him. And it's really interesting because while my husband was passing away, there was such faith and such love and such hope, and my husband was full of faith until the very end. And uh, after he passed away, it was like, now what? I felt like I was so on my own, and God's presence was not tangible like it was when my husband was still living.
So this is a picture of Daryl, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was just 2 weeks before he crumpled in pain from his kidney cancer.
Mm,
So
mm.
we did this big fundraising gala, because we were working on this television series, and had every reason to believe that we were going to have all the funds we needed to finish this project. And 2 weeks after this, he crumples in pain, and 5 months later, he's gone.
Oh, and I can remember, this is probably the biggest standout for me in your book, is how difficult it was for you to you talked about letting go. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that seems to have been the hardest thing for you to do. Am I right?
It was so difficult to let him go, and to not believe that it felt like my love was strong enough that it could cure anything, that it could defy gravity. It just felt like it was that powerful. And I didn't, and I had all the faith to believe that and my husband was super positive. He was never once negative. I mean, he went through some grief about gonna, missing the kids and the grandkids, and wondering how they would turn out and how they would grow and what they would become. So, he did have some grief about that, but he never was depressed about any of it. And
You
so
had you had mentioned that Kubler-Ross's stages of grief are really for the dying. How was he in relationship to those stages? Did he go all through them, including
he
acceptance? No,
he
5
didn't.
months is not a
He
long
he
time.
did go through some at the very end. He I think maybe the last 3 or 4 weeks, he went through the acceptance. And when we had the palliative care meeting with our kids, he showed tremendous leadership and faith, and he turned that into an event not about death, but about life. And it was really a miracle to watch his leadership and his faith and his joy, and how he helped our children process their grief for him while he was still living. It was really remarkable.
How did that experience affect your approach to your own death?
To my own death,
Mhm.
well, he really taught us how to die beautifully.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Because he had this most beautiful faith. He was in tremendous pain. I mean, he suffered, but he had such faith and such joy, and he was so positive, and people would come to encourage him, and they would leave encouraged. I tell the story about one of our university president friends who came to encourage him and left with a message that Daryl spoke about hospitality at the hospital. He said, "You know what hospitality really is?" And they went on this whole thing, and he's just like, uh, talking about receiving people just as they are into your life and welcoming. I mean, he was just like so full of love and life, and telling the nurses thank you, and he was just fantastic the whole time. And telling our kids, you know what they meant to him, and what he saw in them. It was an amazing, it was beautiful. It was really beautiful.
We're
uh,
talking with Lorrie Fields about her memoir, Twice Widowed, and I want to show the cover again because we're also going to move on to the project that you and Daryl were working on. But I want to give people a chance again to see the cover. It's a very vulnerable, raw story, and you really It must have been hard to write.
Well, I did put in a little bit of humor every once in a while. Even my guy friends are saying, you're making me laugh and then cry at the same time. But you know what? I wrote it first as my journal, and then my friends were like, "No, you need to publish this." And then after I was writing it, and I realized the transformation that was happening in me and how I was able to transcend this grief and this darkness in my life and find joy again, that it would be important to be that vulnerable and not be prescriptive. I mean, I really focused in this book on not trying to explain, but just to tell the narrative of my story. I am working on a survival guide for loss that I will
Good.
do more of that. But I think when people are hurting, if you just tell your story and you tell how you went through things and you just stick to the narrative, then it's not demeaning to people and they're not comparing themselves to you, and you're not telling them how they're supposed to process.
Okay, there is someone who's asked a question in the
Sure.
chat, so I'm going to throw it
Yes.
up there if I can. Lori Joseph asks, do you believe the presence of a loved one can be felt after they've passed?
Well, I think the essence of their love is always with you. So I do think that I'm not a very superstitious person in the sense that, I mean, I know people want to see their loved ones, and I'm not agreeing or disagreeing that he's in the birds or animals that come around. That I don't know. I really don't know. It's just that my mind doesn't go there.
Uh-huh.
But I remember the love that we have, and I feel like for me to move forward, I need to honor the memories that we had, but not cling to them in a way, because I was doing that for a while, clinging to them in a way that prevented me from moving forward. So, like, for a while, you sort of keep all their memorabilia around, and then after a while, it was starting to get in my way. And I knew that in order to be true to myself, that I couldn't constantly be in pain over the loss of him. But it also meant that I was healing too, and that I was making new memories, and that I was processing and filing those memories in a different place in my there's different memory systems in your brain. And I'm going to be talking about this in the next book, but there's different memory systems in your brain, and it takes a while for them to shift to a different space. So in the beginning, they're always right there, right?
Yeah.
And that's normal and that's fine and that's how it should be. But some people, they because it feels like a betrayal, they keep them there. And so they don't move forward. Like my dad was like that. And he died, never being able to really move forward with his life after he lost, which was my stepmother, but a very dear, wonderful
Mhm.
woman. He never really moved forward from her. And so,
When someone doesn't move forward, what's the contrast between that life that they continue to live as opposed to the life they could live if they moved forward? What's the
well, they're
contrast?
just talking about the past in a way that brings pain. And I always can tell because of the pain they have. I can talk about I'm starting right now for the first time to be able to remember Daryl with joy and laughter and smiles. It took a while to get to that place. But some people can be 20 years and they still talk about the death of someone, and they're still there. They're still in that pain. And so, I feel like they still need to heal from that a little bit, or they need to learn how to trust that they can be okay. And I ask this question a lot in my book of myself, and I've done it my whole life, even if, and I've gone through some really difficult times, because you imagine that life can't get any better. But I've always challenged myself to say, even if this happens, can I believe that I can thrive again? And that's a difficult question to ask. I remember asking that when my son was brain injured, and it's like, well, even if he doesn't get better, will I be okay? Because I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't imagine if
Mm.
he died too, what would happen to me.
Right.
But once I could answer that question, and I remember having this argument with myself and perhaps with God on the balcony of my parents' condo in Honolulu. And I knew that that was a question I had to answer. It was just like heavy on me that I need to answer the even if, like, will I be okay even if the worst happens? And I couldn't answer it for the longest time, John. It was like, I mean, just thinking about it, I could probably tear up about it because I remember that girl who was struggling to answer that question.
Right. Right.
And I think that's a really important question for all of us to ask at different times. Like, even if, am I going to be okay? And it takes it, and that is what the suffering part does. It pulls out of you those doubts that need to be dealt with. It's those doubts about life. It's the fears. Maybe it's unhealed things from our past. It's like, that's what suffering does. And a lot of people never have to deal with things that are in there anyway, right?
Right.
But when you're suffering, you have to answer it. It's life and death to answer those questions.
Right.
And
Right.
so I have to say, okay, I believe that I'm going to be okay, even if my son
Mhm.
dies too, or even if Daryl doesn't get healed of cancer, or even if my funding disappears for my nonprofit, or even if, all of these things, I had to answer those all along the way to get better. And I still
Okay.
have to answer them.
Yeah, it's a process. I want to move on to the book that you and Daryl wrote together, "The Seed of a Nation." We're switching gears here a little bit because this has nothing to do with grief, although it's a dead guy you're writing about. It's William Penn. Talk a little bit about "The Seed of a Nation."
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, okay, so we moved from Hawaii to Pennsylvania. My husband and we were helping to run a hotel renovation business in Honolulu. We did all the outrigger hotels there, my family. And anyway, so Daryl was being more and more involved in our local church there and traveling throughout the South Pacific. And in those days, he had a beautiful voice. And so he would just sing all around the South Pacific and everywhere. People would always invite him to go sing. And so he was traveling a lot and singing, and we were making money and enjoying Hawaii. And all of a sudden he feels like he wants to go into ministry, which I was against for a while.
Oh my, okay.
Yeah, because it was such a big change and switch in life, a big
Hmm.
career change. Um, but after living in Hawaii for 10 years, I finally agreed to that. And it's another long story, but we finally end up in Pennsylvania. And it was such a different ecosystem from what we were used to. Hawaii is, you're on an island, um, and I think there's something really beautiful about island life in that, especially in Hawaii, the spirit of aloha is real, and your family with your neighbors, with everybody's auntie and uncle. And we moved to Pennsylvania, and it wasn't like that at all. My daughter
People
called.
were mean and nasty
Well,
and
no, it was just that they were more reserved, and you didn't call people auntie and uncle. And my daughter, who was maybe she was five at the time, she said to an older woman, she called her Mimi or something, because she heard her grandkids call her that, and she assumed it was equivalent to auntie in Hawaii, and so she calls her Mimi. And this older woman like grabs her by the shoulder and yanks her shoulder down. She looks at me like I'm a bad mother for not teaching my daughter,
oh man.
you will never call me Mimi. That's only for my grandma. And we're like, if it wasn't just that, it was just like people didn't cross rivers. And it was like, well, how do they go to Philly for cheesesteak, if they don't cross the Susquehanna? And it was like they stayed in their little communities. And so we're like, well, if we're going to be here to serve the people, we need to learn about this region.
Mhm.
So we started just researching the mindsets of the people, not really knowing what we were doing. We were in our early 30s, so we didn't know what we were doing. And so we just started researching the history, and we ran into the person of William Penn. Well, history was my major, so I knew who William Penn was. My husband did too, but what we hadn't known was that when he established Pennsylvania, he really tried to break from British Empire building trajectory, and he included the Native Americans in the government, or at least he attempted to. And we thought that was so fascinating, and it was such an opposite. The inclusion that he was attempting was so opposite to the exclusion we were feeling there, that we
Right.
thought, well, there's something to this. And so, at the time we were writing it, we were pastors and we were pastoring a church. And so I think, our language would probably change a little bit because back 25 years ago, there wasn't the same kind of political divide that we have in our nation now,
Right.
right?
Right.
So as we wrote this book, we write it because we feel like, well, Thomas Jefferson called Penn the greatest lawgiver the world has ever produced, and Voltaire and all these people looked to him and to Pennsylvania as this, anomaly in world history, and it was at the time, but it wasn't perfect, and the world wasn't ready necessarily for a message, and Penn wasn't perfect in his presentation of the message either. And so, but when we wrote the book, I think we were a little bit enamored by the story and Penn. And then as we grew and we learned more, and then as society changed and we realized that this racism that Daryl first noticed, when we were writing the book, because Daryl had felt like, had the world been able to follow Penn's example and be inclusive, like Penn was trying to be with the natives, it could have stemmed some of the racism that happened throughout
What prevented
American history.
the because he was not a founding father, but he was a contemporary of them and influential with
But
them.
he was influential,
So what prevented them from adopting his vision?
well, I think the default in humanity to dominate and control, and that empire building and manifest destiny, and the doctrine of discovery, and all of that was so embedded in humanity. It's just the default of humanity. And so for Penn, it took a lot of bravery. I mean, you lost your head for defying the king, right? And for being an independent thinker. And so, sort of like now, there's a lot of purity tests right now in politics. Same then. And like when I was writing the TV series, I would be writing a scene, and it would be the exact same dynamics happening in the news. And I went, "Oh my gosh, I just wrote that. I just wrote that scene."
Well, let's
How the
put
king
a
was
name.
inviting.
Let's put a name to it. We're talking Donald Trump and MAGA, right?
we're talking about well, this story, this one scene. I'll tell you this one scene, and
Okay.
you'll be able to add Donald Trump to that. But the scene was when King Charles was inviting Louis, the King of France, his cousin, to interfere in the elections. And he was taking pension from him, secret pension, and making all these secret treaties and these secret negotiations. Well, that was the same time in 2000, in the first election, where I heard, and I was watching the news, and Trump was saying, yeah, Russia, release Hillary's
Right.
email.
If you're listening, yeah, Russia, if
If
you're
you're listening.
listening,
And it's like,
release
wait,
Hillary's email.
I just wrote that scene.
Right.
But that was happening all along. And both sides extremes were using the politics for their agenda, right? So it wasn't just the right that I was writing the other side too, because there were hardly anybody in the middle who was willing to just, like what Penn said, it was a really beautiful thing. He says, now that we've tried all this other violent stuff and this manipulative stuff, he says, let us try what love will do. And so that's how he came and approached the Native Americans. And he says, we will live with you with love and consent and free of weapons. That had never happened before in world history. For a leader and a European leader to lay down their weapons strategically, not because
Right.
you're weak, not because they were Quakers. I mean, Penn was a trained swordsman. He wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps, but he laid down his sword deliberately because he knew that if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. In other words, you're bound by those same rules.
Right.
Right. And so that's how this, my story about embracing suffering is so important, because it causes you to transcend. And so the kind of humanity that could transcend the violence is those that have embraced this kind of bravery to lay down their weapons, because it takes more bravery to do that than to pick up a weapon or drop a bomb or to manipulate or to use finances to control people. It takes a lot more bravery, and it's a lot messier to get people to collaborate and come together and try to form some kind of collaboration and agreement.
How
So,
is the book being received?
well, it was really interesting because when we first wrote it, we were really surprised that really far extremes were using the book for their agenda. And so before Daryl died, he was rewriting it because he knew he needed to correct that, because some on the right were taking it and using it to say that we're supposed to be a Christian nation. And, and Daryl's like, well, when do you impose the Inquisition?
Right.
Because
Right.
it's really anti-Christian to say you're a Christian nation.
Right. Right. Well, it's
And that's
against
a
the
hard thing to say.
Constitution.
I'm
It's
going
against
to
the
be
Constitution
crucified
too.
to say that because
Right.
because the gospel is invitational, right? And it allows, it's like love with your when you love your kids, you have to let them fail and make mistakes. That's what love does.
Love is a choice. Otherwise, it's not love. It's dictatorship.
Right. And so to try to say, well, we were founded as a Christian nation. Well, Penn was a Christian, but you can't put Penn in the same sentence. He fought his whole life for religious liberty. So you can't put religious liberty and a Christian nation in the same sentence. They're opposite
Why
of each
not?
other.
Why not?
Because religious liberty allows you not to choose.
Right. I
Religious
mean, I can
liberty,
remember Obama getting dinged because he talked about people of faith and of no faith, as if that was some sort of heretical statement, when it's just being recognizing that this is a big pluralistic country.
but like what Penn said, he said you may force us to believe, because at the time that they were being forced to believe a certain way, and if you didn't agree with whoever the dominant power was, whatever their faith was, whether it was, during the Commonwealth, the Puritans, or whether it was Catholicism or the Anglican Church, you could be killed, right? So it was really dangerous to do that. But Penn said, you can make hypocrites of us, but you're never going to make us true believers. So, so he really focused on civil liberties and said that the law was only an expedient, because he knew that people couldn't live by love. So the law was just an expedient until people could. And so he was really determined to show by example by including Native Americans in the government. And he wanted Native Americans to sit on juries and different things. But none of that took hold because people weren't ready for it. And so that's one of the reasons why Daryl and I wanted, just because when we saw that both right and left people were taking our book to use it for their agenda and not and missing the spirit of the thing, because you have a form without the power if you leave out the Native American part of it and the whole thing, the whole message of love and consent.
So
Right.
our conversation right now is taking place in January of 2025. Trump has not yet been inaugurated for his second presidency. Based on what you had, the conversations that you've had with people, the things that you've read, the things that you know about William Penn, what is your, I don't know, prediction or sense of what it's going to be like in these next 4 years?
Well, I mean, I think that there has been this militant side to Christianity for a long time. I mean, it started in the 4th century, really, with the marriage of church and state with Constantine, right? So when Penn was trying to change the trajectory, he was really going against what happened in the 4th century, at least trying to change that way of the church thinking that it needed to legitimize itself through political power. And so but there was that marriage of church and state that happened. One of my really good friends is writing a series of novels right now, and the one that I'm reading right now, his first one, the day of the labyrinth.
Labyrinth. Mm-hmm.
It's a fiction about what would have happened had Constantine been a true believer and lived in love and not domination, and an empire hadn't taken root and been established as part of the way the church built itself too. So he's writing a series of novels, and I'm going to be helping him when he gets to England and the European part of it. But anyway, so Penn was trying to do that, and the world wasn't ready for it when Penn was alive. And is it ready for it now? I don't know. But this chaos and this suffering might get us there.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Here's the thing. The thing I don't understand, and maybe you can help me figure this out. I do not understand why the evangelicals are so enthralled with Trump, who lies reflexively, has no character, of no concern about other people other than himself. Grievance is his thing, and I do not understand why evangelicals are going for him. I no longer identify as an evangelical because of the evangelicals who support him, and these are friends of mine. Many of them are really smart, and they should know better. So what's going on here?
Well, I think I hear what you're saying. I really do. I understand it. I think there's an overreaction to a left agenda that they felt forced on them. So I think it's an overreaction to that. But anytime you have an overreaction to something, that you always create more injustice, right? You overact injustice and you create more injustice. So there needs to be this more moderate approach to how we engage, and we can't leave out our morals and our principles, and the idea that we are not to love our enemies, when it's one of the most popular scriptures in all the Bible, to love our enemies, right? And to love our neighbors as ourselves. And that message is lost on us right now is really hard to understand.
Yeah.
But it's not hard to understand when you realize that this violent nature of empire has been in the church for millennia, not just now.
Well, and racism is baked into the DNA of the United States.
Right. And so it's a big ship to turn, right? And so again, the reason when my husband and I first started writing about the Penn story and going around, we did not realize how disruptive a message of love really is, because love disallows everything love is not.
Explain that.
Okay, so love doesn't just roll over and say whatever, it's not passive. Love, like Penn, lays down his weapon and stands up in the face of death, even if that's what's required, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody wants a love that's stronger than death, which is why Romeo and Juliet and the story of the cross is so powerful. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants that, but not everybody can do that. Right?
Whew.
And so when you suffer, which is why I feel so blessed in my life to have suffered, because when you suffer, you're not so worried about that anymore. Right?
Yeah.
Those are the people that you trust, because they're not in it for themselves or their agenda or their economic advantage. And you know, and I'm not talking about just finances. I'm talking about reputation, because it's the economy of our lives, where we get our reputation, what makes us compromise, right? So if I think that you are going to advance my reputation, then I'm corruptible if I need that.
Right.
But when you suffer, you lose the ability to be corrupted.
Right. And because it brings out a certain humility as opposed to hubris.
Right.
And that, I mean, right now, it's almost considered treasonous for Republicans in Congress to negotiate with Democrats.
It is treasonous. That's what's so sad. And that's why Daryl wanted to rewrite the book, because when we first wrote the book, that wasn't the case. Democrats and Republicans played baseball together and had dinner together. Right. So things have changed, right?
Are you hopeful for the future?
I am, in the sense that I still think God exists. And okay. I don't think he's mad at all. I think and if my husband were alive, he'd say this is exactly the chaos we need, because certain parts of Christendom need to be in its death throes. And that's why we see lots of overreaction. People are panicking, panicking, panicking. But it doesn't, you can't take God out of the air. Even if people take him off the dollar or off buildings or whatever, you can't get rid of him, right?
All
So
right. Well,
he's not nervous.
one of the people I've interviewed on this podcast, Cliff Kelly. I don't know if you know Cliff, but you're a graduate of Regent University, and Cliff taught there, and he has written a book, and we talked about it. He believes that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. Do you go that far?
I'm not willing to go that far, because I mean, I want to believe in his humanity,
Trump's humanity.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I want to believe in his humanity. And I think that there's all kinds of motivations behind some of the things that he does, right? That you can sort of judge people by their fruit and by their behavior. So you can see some of that. And I think the saddest thing for me is that Christians are willing to live with the at least. Well, at least we get this, at least we get that, at least this, at least that, and be willing to put up with things. Because love, like when I love my kids, I don't go, well, at least they're not, taking heroin. I'll put up with this. At least they're not. No, when my kids misbehave, even as an adult, I say, honey, that's not cool.
Right.
But I don't take a weapon and beat them and punish them. I mean,
when Stephen revealed to me that he was using heroin, my gut reaction was not to banish him from the family. We had a long hour and a half heart to heart. And I looked to help him identify what the problems were.
Beautiful.
And, he was on the way back to, recovery, but that's a long slog, and it
terrible.
It didn't work out. But, the point I'm making is sort of reinforcing what you've said, that you can't, we're going back to love versus control. Love allows the other person to make life-threatening mistakes, and in that case,
and it's so difficult to watch.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to watch. And yet, what is the opposite of that? Like Penn said, we're making hypocrites of everybody.
Yeah.
And it will eventually, like you can win a war and you can dominate people, but you don't really create peace that way, because there's this underbelly of dissatisfaction that once it has its opportunity will rise up, which has happened throughout history. I mean, I'm a historian, to think of a million stories where that's happened. Just because you win doesn't mean you win. Doesn't mean you've won the peace.
Exactly.
Right? So you just create more trauma, more problems. And so, which is why the whole story of the cross, like people want that kind of love that's willing to go to death for what's right and going to death for love. And it's like the movie, The Mission, it's such a beautiful story because they're showing the opposite of domination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And those are the kinds of stories that change the atmosphere.
Right.
But if we live by the sword, we die by the sword. I know I mentioned that before. And so as believers, if we're willing to live with that least, if we're willing to live by the rules of the world, we're never going to transcend. We're never going to have a message. We're never going to be able to permeate the ugliness of the world with love if we're bound by the rules by picking up sword, because that's what happens. That's the principle. You pick up the sword, you die by it. You will live by those rules, and you're stuck in it.
One of the things
to transcend.
Lorrie, you and I could go on for a long time, and you're very passionate about this. And I
can't believe you got me to talk about this.
Well, that's my gift, I guess, or whatever. But you're very passionate about this and articulate, which leads me to much more of a mundane question, a nutsy boltsy writer question, in terms of the process. You've written, both of your books are nonfiction, memoir and history. Is there a different approach to the two different books that you've written? Obviously, the subject matter is different, but what about your writing process? How do you approach it?
Well, obviously, my memoir is my personal story, so I did try to stick to a narrative, more than. And Daryl did most of the work on the Seed of a Nation book, and like I said, he would have written it a bit differently. I mean, we have another book. His original research I published. I published it really as a gift for our donors, calling Healing Pennsylvania's Wounds, because when we first moved to Pennsylvania, John Dawson had his book Healing America's Wounds, which now I think is kind of a silly imperialistic name. But anyway, that was the title of it at the time. And I wrote a foreword in there that really reflects more of our thinking. And I want to expand on that, and I want to write on that. And Daryl was rewriting it, and all that work still lives in his computer, and I need to get to it. But I really want to get back to working on the television series, which is really a historical drama, which we're going to, I think I've studied William Penn long enough to know how he would think when the history isn't explicit.
Do you see this as a series?
Yeah, it was started. We thought we would do a feature, but the story is so big that our entertainment attorney, our producers at the time were saying, well, why don't we turn it into a series? But I just went to London and talked to some folks and said, well, maybe we'll go back to doing a feature. So it's like, I think
my argument is you'll get more traction as a series
I
because you
wanted
can
the
go
series.
deeper. You can go deeper with the characters. It's almost like a West Wing of Pennsylvania in the 1600s.
It's really swashbuckling. You'll love it. Of course, I'd love to tell. You get me talking about that. It's really swashbuckling because I start the whole thing showing how violent both religion and politics are, and that's my point. And some of my British friends were like, "No, we need to do more like Pride and Prejudice." I go, "No. The point is to show the violence of it, and then show my character attempting to do something different.
Okay,
and then leave the audience with this unfinished business of humanity that we all have to deal with."
May it be so.
I know.
This is how people can contact you, LorrieFields.com. It's not case sensitive, but I've capitalized the L and the F so that you can see it more clearly. And so there's a portal on your website for people to contact you.
Yeah, it's in the process of being rebuilt, but it's there and you can contact me.
Right. And you do a lot of public speaking, and I would imagine that people can, get you to come and speak to their group. You could do, I'm putting words in your mouth. You could probably do it, virtually and in person, depending, right?
Yeah, I just got to get myself together. I don't have my staff anymore, so it's, I'll get it together. You can help me.
I've never had a staff.
You can instruct me.
So I'm John DeDakis, and you've been one-to-one with me. That's my contact information, johndedakis.com. We've been one-to-one with Lorrie Fields. And Lorrie, before I let you go, is there anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to address?
Well, I want to tell people to get your book because I finished it in 3 settings because I loved it so much.
Thank you.
And I know exactly why you wrote it, and I resonate. I resonate with you and your story and your message and all that you're doing. And so I loved it.
Well, thank you. The book is,
show it.
I have a copy of it right here.
Yeah.
Although my screen is blurred, so you might not be able to see it. It's called Enemies Domestic. I can't.
It's a fast read.
There it is.
Yeah.
My protagonist, Lark Chadwick, is a White House press secretary. She's pregnant, ambivalent about becoming a single mom. Abortion is a crime, and a dictator becomes president. So it's a comedy. But thank you. I appreciate that.
It was a fast read too. It was like easy to read, and I enjoyed it so much. So yeah.
Anything about you that I didn't ask?
I don't know. People can ask me anything. I'm pretty open about.
Yes, apparently I've noticed that.
I had to get over myself to be able to do that, right?
And I've heard somebody say, somebody wrote a memoir, and the criticism was, "You sure use I a lot. It's a memoir." But you can find different ways to say it.
No biography or memoir is ever complete, but I did try. I mean, I have studied screenwriting, so I knew how to tell a story. you know,
Right.
and
Right.
so I focused on the parts of my story that would tell the story I wanted to tell, you know,
Okay.
and so yeah, there's always so much more to talk about, though.
There is. You're a delight to talk with. I hope that once you have, you're writing this roadmap about grief that I think will help other people. You have a lot of irons in the fire, so I wish you well.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for
Thank you.
having me on.
You bet. Bye.
Okay.